Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I finished another mixed media study with color pencil and watercolor, in between working on more polished work. While the study was more frustrating than usual, I decided to share it in the end and give some thoughts on my process, difficult pieces, and how to find joy by letting go of perfectionism. Let's get started. For this study, I used my Winsor & Newton Cotman 12-pan watercolor set, a 2B pencil, a 140-pound 300 GSM watercolor paper, a POSCA paint pen, and the 12-pencil Faber-Castell Polychromos set. Everything is listed in the description below. I began the process by transferring my initial sketch onto watercolor paper with the pencil and a light box. I always try to capture the most important landmarks and facial features in my lines, like eye placement and where the pit of the neck is. It's hard to see fine detail through the thick watercolor paper, but I think that's actually an advantage. I wanted to avoid over-detailing the lines because I wanted the values and colors to carry the study and define the forms. Once I taped down the paper to my desk, I began laying down the background washes. The first layer was a cool blue mixed with a touch of red, followed by yellow-green for the ground plane. I made sure to layer wet on wet to maintain the soft, out-of-focus effect the original reference photo had. I used a similar technique on my last mixed media study. Then, I dotted in some deeper greens and browns to add color variation before moving on to the sky. My next wash of blue had even more red mixed in, which drove the color closer to purple. In the original photo, the sky is covered in storm clouds, which created bands of shadow and light. I recreated this with a third layer of paint while the previous layers were still wet. After that, I let the paper fully dry. In one of my tests you can see off to the side, I accidentally painted in the figure while the background was still wet and the colors began to bleed. This time, I kept the division between the cooler background colors and the warm base of the skin. Once that layer was dry, I added a warm reddish orange to increase the saturation. Part of the appeal of the original photo was the stark contrast between the cool background and the warm tones on the figure where the sunlight is hitting. In the past, my watercolor washes have been too muted and hesitant, so I purposefully pushed the saturation to combat this. The shirt came next, along with the darker values on the hair, lips, and eyes, once the previous layer was dry. The beginning of the blotchy issues started with the shadow area of the shirt. I think I should have waited for it to fully dry before I laid down the shadow color. This issue persisted in the next wash of dark purple for the shadows on the face. I noticed that one of my problems when painting with watercolor is edge control. I can make soft edges using wet on wet, but controlling medium and hard edges is still difficult for me. However, once the layer was dry, I actually liked the soft gradient on the face. The problem was I didn't know how to maintain that. As I continued layering, the shadows became more and more uneven. The combination of too much water and overworked paper eventually made me decide to step back and work on unifying the background colors instead with one more transparent wash. At this point, I wondered if I should have started over. The hues weren't saturated enough, and the shadows were even blotchier when dry. Then I remembered my first mixed media study. The watercolors were also uneven there, but I trusted color pencil's opacity and my ability to blend to unify the values and define form. I decided to try that again. In any medium I've tried, there are always ugly phases to my work, whether it's traditional or digital. The trick is to not panic and abandon something too soon. Instead of saying, it's ruined, I try to think, okay, how can I fix this? Of course, there are times where it would be better to start off from scratch. Usually, those times involve foundational issues with the underdrawing. My problems this time were in the blending, not the drawing, so I decided to proceed onwards with a little faith in the process. The second tip I have for working on difficult pieces is to give yourself a confidence boost if you can. While the figure had issues, I was overall pleased with how the background was turning out, so I decided to focus here first. In the reference, there are darker clumps of grass. I used a mixture of my blues, magenta, and browns to create these deeper values. Once I had layered 3 to 4 colors together, I took the blending stump and rubbed gently to unify everything. The darkest areas had a small amount of black dotted in to neutralize those colors. After that, I added depth to the underbellies of the clouds and also added in some white to neutralize the purple-blue in the lighter areas. I didn't want the background to distract from the focal point, so I kept the contrast muted in both the ground and the sky. Once I felt confident again, I decided to work on the figure, starting with the shirt. I layered on colors, defined form shadows, and slowly blended my way to something that captured the warmth of the sunset on the front and the coolness of the storm clouds on the back. From there, I continued rendering the neck and finally the face, slowly figuring out what color combinations worked best to capture what I saw in the original reference. I didn't have a good grasp on how deep I wanted my values to go until I defined the irises, pupils, and lashes. The immediate contrast brought by these features showed me two things. One, I still needed to push the shadows on the left side of the face. Two, I needed to add more warmth to all the lit areas. While I still wasn't entirely happy with the study, I now had a plan. Giving yourself concrete steps to take helps keep you focused so that the frustration doesn't overwhelm you. If you need to, take a break, go do something else, and then come back. I did this several times during this study, partially due to scheduling constraints and partially to give my eyes a break. Each time I came back, I noticed something new I could fix or refine, which allowed me to move forward with the piece. Sometimes I needed to neutralize colors with their complements. Other times, I had to better define plane changes and forms in the facial features. In total, this study took almost 4.5 hours if you factor in drying times for the watercolors. It's still not a great study, but I've noted my mistakes, and I know how to improve from here for next time. Let me talk about frustration and perfectionism as the last footage plays out. Over the years, I've seen and also been the artist who makes self-disparaging remarks and puts myself down in pursuit of perfection. Past me wouldn't have wanted to share this study because I can still see mistakes in my blending and how I handled the colors. Present me is sharing it despite these flaws because past me needed to see something besides perfection on social media. In this age, it's easy to think of growth as a strictly linear graph where every drawing, every study is better than the last. But that's not true. Sometimes you make mistakes and need to take one step back before you can take 2 steps forward. That's okay. Growth takes time, and it's not easy to see it unless you take a step back and look at the bigger picture. The other thing I've learned is that seeing mistakes is actually a good thing. The fact that you can see those mistakes means your eye is getting better at analyzing form and can make out more details than it did before. It might take a while, but your skills will eventually also reach this point. However, there's almost always going to be a gap between what your eye can see and what your hands can create, because your eye is also improving in the meantime. The trick I learned is to accept that and let go of the idea of perfection. Perfection is unattainable, so focus instead on the process. Perfectionism robbed me of my joy once. Patience and kindness towards myself gave it back and eventually made me a better artist than I would have otherwise been. And here's the finished study. While it's not my best work, I'm still glad I did it. Thanks for listening to the end, and I hope it inspired you to draw or paint something today. Keep creating, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!